folks, welcome to Weiss Advice powered by BeatStars.com. This is going to be the first of a three-part video series on unique dynamic effects focused on expansion. But before we get into that, first a special shout out to Placebo Beats for supplying the record that we're using for demonstration purposes here. And everything I'm going to discuss right now is going to require some background knowledge of compression. If you are not really up on compressors and the terminology, hop on over to my compression primer video first and then come back here. Okay, what is expansion? Well, expansion is basically the opposite of compression. In a compressor, we take a loud sound and we make it quieter. In an expander, we take a loud sound and we make it louder. Why would we want to do this? Well, sometimes we want to bring out a particular shape of a sound without bringing the overall sound up. So we might want to have more sustain, or we might want to have more attack, and we want to get there in a very, very specific way. I'm going to demonstrate this idea using the clap in this record. We can hear that this clap has a really good sustain and release, but the attack of it is not particularly punchy. There's definitely some punch and some transient there. It's just not a lot. And when we hear it overall in the record, we really only hear that sustain of the clap, that sort of white noisy texture that's coming from it. So I'm going to use some expansion to bring out the leading edge and the sharpness of this clap so that it really cuts through our mix. So I'm going to pop on over here and pull up the Fruity compressor. And normally when we have the compressor set up, we think of it as starting at 1:1 and we turn it to the right and the compression becomes more pronounced. But there is a very, very unique side of this, which is that as we turn it to the left, we can actually go below 1:1 and go to 0.9:1 or 0.8:1, 0.7:1, all the way down to 0.4:1. So if we have it set at 0.5:1, what this is effectively saying is now whenever a signal exceeds the threshold, we're going to double it. And that can allow for certain sounds to become very pronounced. So I'm going to start with the attack set at 0 milliseconds, start at the release at 1 millisecond, here as fast as it goes. I'm just going to start turning down the threshold, and you're going to hear the attack of the clap start to become more pronounced. And if I bring that into the overall mix, the clap immediately becomes a lot more defined. We can really hear it in the record. It has a very specific sharp attack. Now, we can use our attack and release controls to time and shape the transient if we want. This is a little weird, and this is only the Fruity compressor. I don't know why it's set up this way, but when we go into expansion mode, the attack and the release switch places. What that means is that if we want a longer sustain, a wider attack, so to speak, a more beefy attack, so to speak, we have to slow the attack down. And if we want a rounder attack or less attack overall coming up, we have to slow the release down. This is very counterintuitive, and this is not the way most expanders work. It's kind of bizarre, but yeah, they've switched functions. So let's start by slowing down the attack and listening to the texture of the clap. Do you feel how that transient feels very thick now? It's got a lot of body in it. It's much punchier. Here's with the attack all the way at 0. It's very sharp and very pronounced and defined. Here it is over at 80 milliseconds. It's very beefy and punchy, and so these are uniquely different, and they will sound uniquely different in the mix. Now, let's start slowing down the release and see what happens. Even going to as short as 35 milliseconds, we've really rounded the attack out so much that we're not even really bringing the attack up so much at all. But if we function within about 1 to 10 milliseconds, we get a contouring of the attack. We could have a very spiky attack, or a softer, rounder attack. And those are both going to sit very differently in the record overall. Let's give a listen to how these things sound in context. Let's do the spiky attack first, with a very spiky release. I'm using these words interchangeably because it's confusing, but let's go to a spiky sound. Sounds cool. Now let's make it punchy. Now it's really forward. So let's make it a little less punchy. Let's keep some of that punch. And let's round out the attack just a little bit. What's cool about this is because of the nature of this clap, as I start slowing the attack down, it starts to almost feel more like a group of people that are all kind of just a little bit out of sync with their clapping, which is a really kind of cool effect. So I kind of like it a little slowed down just for the intention of the sound. Maybe let's try 4 milliseconds, see if we can get like the best of both worlds. That's pretty cool. I like that a lot. And this gives us this whole kind of group clap sound. So without it, we have this. With it, we have this. Mind you, this is dramatically different than just simply turning it way up. When I turn it way up without using this expansion technique, it starts to kind of mask and cloud the overall mix. But when I use this expansion technique, because I'm specifically just bringing up the transient energy, we're kind of keeping the clap overall in the same place, but just adding more punch to it, and so it leaves more room for the rest of the mix to breathe. Now, let's take a look at the same idea except for on a kick drum, because we're going to notice that the way that we shape the transient in the kick is going to have a profound effect on the overall sound of the kick. So I'm going to grab the fruity compressor here, and let's turn our kick down for now. All right. So again, traditionally we would be using our ratios in positive modes, but because we're going for expansion, I'm going to turn this down a little bit here. We're going to go to, say, 0.6 to 1, and I'm going to set this as fast as possible, and now I'm going to start turning down the threshold. Now, notice when I turn down the threshold on the kick, we start getting a lot of noticeable distortion. It sounds like clipping. The reason is because we're getting that intermodulation distortion that we were talking about before. The kick waveforms are much slower than the clap waveforms because they're lower in frequency. And because of that, we need to slow our release and our attack times down respectively so that we're not causing that modulation. So first thing I'm going to do is start slowing down the attack, which is basically going to allow more time for the gain to gradually return back to where it's supposed to be. You hear that cleans up the distortion pretty quickly. Now I'm going to start playing around with this release time, which is going to define how quickly our attack is sharpening, and see if maybe smoothing it out a little bit helps and keeps it a little cleaner. So yeah, so around 10 milliseconds, we get a rounder, beefier kind of attack, and it's a lot cleaner overall. Now I'm going to disable the compression. Bring it back. It just sounds like a punchier version of the kick itself. Now, where things start getting very interesting is when we start turning the threshold lower. Here we can get that really hard style kick by using a very fast release and just timing our attack very cautiously. And I think that's a pretty great sound for this particular record. Now, I also like to play around with things like the knee because those can have profound effects. Basically, when we start softening the knee, we're going to start enhancing the attack a little bit earlier. We're going to get a more immediate rise in the sound. And so we start getting different textures and contours of the overall attack. Overall, I like the medium, I like the hard, I like the vintage. They're all doing something different and they're all doing something cool. Medium is giving me the most forward sound, so let's hear how that sounds in the context of the overall record. Before. After. Now, mind you, a lot of the times when it comes to drum samples, we don't always need to be going in and doing these complicated and unique effects. Sometimes just turning it up is really all we need. But I kind of like it with a slightly sharper attack. To me, it cuts through the record a little bit better, and ultimately I think it's going to produce a better result. So is it better than just turning the signal up? In this case, yes. In some cases, not always. Now, let's take a look at a way that we can flip this. Sometimes we want to bring out the sustain of something. And if we want to do that, we're going to have to mess around with things a lot more. Instead of having this very, very sharp attack controlled by the release here, I'm going to slow this down quite a bit. And you notice that we're not enhancing the attack very much. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the ratio down so that we get a more pronounced effect. I'm going to turn the attack down so that we get more sustain, and I'm going to make the release here pretty slow. I'm going to go back into hard knee, and I'm going to turn the threshold way down. And what you hear is now the sustain of the signal coming way up. Without it, with. Of course, we need to do some makeup gain here to compensate. Without, with. Now, obviously, that's very, very sustain heavy. If I back off the ratio and get it closer to 1:1, level match it a little bit more closely. You'll notice that the drum thickens up. We get more of that sustain and that boom. So depending on what we want from this kick, we can use this upward expansion as a means of getting it, whether we want a sharper, punchier, more defined attack, which a lot of the times we do, or if we want an overall thicker sound, something that has more body and more weight. So let's hear that in the context of the mix. Before. After. That's kind of cool too. It's just the kick is now bloomed outward. It takes up just way more of the low end. So if we can make space for that in the record, then we're going to have this big, weighty, heavy kick, which can be great in a club as well. It just depends on if we want something that's got a lot of punch or if we want something that has a lot of boof. And it really just comes down to our vision for the record. So expansion can be a really, really cool technique in that regard. The other thing that we can use expansion for is just cleaning things up in general. So let's take our compressor off. And let's go back to this clap. Let's set the level of the clap where it sounds like it's nice and prominent in the mix without any kind of expansion. About there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in the fruity compressor. And this time what I'm going to do is before setting the threshold, I'm going to set the makeup gain. So I've turned the overall signal down. Now what I'm going to do is start replenishing the attack of the signal alone. Without. With. So let's hear it in the context of the mix real quick. Without. With. One more time. Without. With. So by doing this, I've effectively cut a lot of the sustain down, which means that there's now more room for other elements because there's less of this sustaining, weighting clap sound. Now, I don't think that this is appropriate for this record. I just wanted to demonstrate that one of the ways that we can make space for things in a record is by lowering the sustain of a sound. All right, guys.